Fridays had always been my refuge, the one part of my week that felt like a safe harbor. For years, my best friend Liam and I had a standing tradition: dinner, laughter, and easy conversation. It was predictable, comforting, and something I looked forward to every week. But this Friday was different. Liam arrived as he always did, balancing a takeout bag in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. He greeted me with his usual grin, cracking a joke about traffic that made me chuckle. But there was something in his energy that felt off, subtle but noticeable. His laughter seemed forced. His gaze shifted away more often than it met mine. As usual, Roxy, my loyal border collie, bounded up to him, her tail wagging furiously. She adored Liam, maybe even more than she adored me. Watching her spin around his legs as he scratched behind her ears always made me smile. Tonight, though, her excitement only emphasized the unease I couldn't quite shake. We settled into our familiar routine, unpacking takeout on the kitchen counter and moving to the living room, where Roxy claimed her usual spot between us on the couch. The TV hummed in the background, an old sitcom we'd both seen 100 times. For the most part, it felt like any other Friday night, until it didn't. At some point, during a lull in our conversation, I noticed Liam looking at me. It wasn't the friendly, casual glance I was used to. There was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't name. It was warm, almost hesitant, and it caught me off guard. "You ever think about how things could have turned out differently?" he asked suddenly, his voice quieter than usual. The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy and out of place. I blinked, unsure how to respond. "You mean if I'd moved to California after college?" I joked, hoping to lighten the mood. He smiled faintly, but didn't laugh. "No, not like that," he said, his gaze drifting back to Roxy, who was now sprawled out between us, oblivious to the tension. I didn't press him further. Something about his tone made me hesitant, like prying might unlock something I wasn't ready to face. Instead, I turned back to the TV, letting the noise fill the silence between us. But even as we fell into our usual banter, I couldn't ignore the shift in the air. Later, when Liam stood to leave, he lingered in the doorway longer than usual. Roxy trotted over to him, wagging her tail as he bent down to scratch her ears one last time. "Sometimes I think she likes me more than you," he teased, his familiar mischievous smile flashing across his face. I laughed, though it felt a little strained. "She has good taste," I replied, trying to match his lightheartedness. But as I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, I couldn't help but feel like something had changed. For years, our friendship had been steady and unshakable, but tonight felt like the beginning of something I couldn't quite define, and wasn't sure I was ready to explore. A few days had passed since that strange Friday night, but Liam's question lingered in my mind. "Do you ever think about how things could have turned out differently?" The words echoed like a song stuck on repeat, pulling me back to the way he'd looked at me. Open, yet guarded. I hadn't reached out to him, and he hadn't called me either. We both needed time, I supposed, to sort through whatever it was that had shifted between us. When he finally texted, asking if I wanted to take Roxy for a walk around Jamaica Pond, I didn't hesitate to say yes. If nothing else, maybe the fresh air would clear my head. The day was overcast, the kind of gray that softened the world rather than dulling it. The leaves had turned to shades of gold and amber, blanketing the pathways in a mosaic of autumn hues. Roxy trotted ahead of us, tail wagging as she sniffed at every tree and shrub. Liam walked beside me, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his steps measured. At first, we made small talk, work updates, plans for the weekend, a funny story about his neighbors and their mischievous cat. It felt normal, almost like the tension of our last meeting had been a fluke. But as we reached the edge of the pond, where the water stretched out like a sheet of glass, he slowed his pace. "Rachel," he said, stopping near a weathered bench. His voice was steady but quiet, like he was trying not to disturb the stillness of the moment. "Have you ever thought about us? About what it would mean if things changed?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes followed the ripples on the pond surface, as if looking away might buy me more time to think. "Changed how?" I asked finally, though I already knew the answer. He let out a soft laugh, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Guess. I'm asking if you've ever thought about us being more than friends. The honesty in his voice knocked the air out of me. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I reached down to pet Roxy, who had circled back and was sitting patiently by my side, her warm gaze flicking between the two of us, as if she understood everything. I don't want to lose what we have, Liam, I said at last, my voice barely above a whisper. You mean too much to me? He nodded, his expression unreadable. I get that. And I don't want to mess this up either. But I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. For a moment, we just stood there, the sounds of the park filling the silence between us, leaves rustling in the breeze, the faint hum of a jogger's steps on the path. Then Liam smiled, a small, bittersweet curve of his lips. Come on, he said, nudging me gently with his elbow. Let's keep walking. Roxy's got too much energy to stand around. As we moved back onto the path, I felt a strange mix of relief and regret. The question had been asked, the door opened, but neither of us had the courage to walk through it just yet. Roxy darted ahead, her tail wagging like a flag, blissfully unaware of the weight hanging between us. Or maybe she knew, and her boundless joy was her way of reminding us that some things, like the love of a good dog, were beautifully uncomplicated. A week had passed since our walk at Jamaica Pond, but the memory of Liam's words still lingered. Have you ever thought about us being more than friends? I couldn't stop replaying the moment, wondering what would have happened if I'd answered differently. Yet neither of us reached out. Maybe we both needed time to process the possibility of something new. By Friday evening, I had convinced myself that the silence between us was a good thing, until there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt as I opened it to find Liam standing there, holding a bouquet of white lilies and a box of pizza. His smile was the same as always, warm and familiar, but his eyes carried a nervousness I hadn't seen before. Dinner for two? He asked, holding up the pizza with a sheepish grin. Roxy immediately raced to greet him, circling his legs and wagging her tail furiously. I couldn't help but laugh, the tension I'd felt all week melting away. Only if you're cooking, I teased, stepping aside to let him in. We made our way to the kitchen, where Liam set the pizza box on the counter and handed me the flowers. As I searched for a vase, he unpacked a small mountain of ingredients. Pizza and cooking? That's ambitious, I said, raising an eyebrow. I thought it'd be fun, he replied, shrugging. Plus, I figured you wouldn't mind a little teamwork. Remember those pottery classes we took? We were terrible, but we laughed the whole time. I couldn't help but smile at the memory. He had a way of turning even my most disastrous attempts at creativity into something worth remembering. As we worked side by side, the kitchen filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of tomato sauce and fresh basil. He chopped vegetables while I mixed the dough, and somewhere in between, our hands brushed as we reached for the same knife. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a warmth through me that lingered long after. When the pizza was finally in the oven, we moved to the living room. Liam settled on the couch, and Roxy immediately claimed his lap, her tail wagging lazily. I brought over 2 glasses of wine, and we fell into one of our effortless conversations. But tonight, it felt different, deeper somehow. I've been thinking about that walk, Liam said after a while, his tone serious but gentle. I nodded, looking down at my glass. So have I. He set his glass on the coffee table and turned to face me. Rachel, I can't keep pretending. You mean more to me than just a friend. You always have. I met his gaze, and for a moment, I couldn't find the words. Instead, I placed my hand over his, letting the warmth of his touch speak for me. Liam leaned in slowly, his eyes searching mine for permission. When our lips met, it was soft, tentative, and filled with a quiet honesty that neither of us could deny. Everything else faded away. The room, the week of silence, the years of friendship. In that moment, there was only us. When we pulled back, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence between us felt full, not empty, an unspoken promise of something new, something worth exploring. Roxy sighed contentedly at our feet, her steady presence grounding us in a way only she could. I woke up early, the kind of early that sneaks up on you before the world has fully stirred. The soft gray light of morning filtered through the curtains, and Roxy was curled up beside me, her steady breathing a comforting rhythm. The previous evening replayed in my mind, a quiet warmth spreading as I remembered Liam's touch, his words, and that kiss. He had left later than usual, after we'd shared a few more laughs and moments of silence that spoke volumes. As the night deepened, so did my understanding of what had changed between us. This wasn't just a shift in our friendship, it was the start of something that had always been there, waiting for us to see it. The air outside was crisp, a typical Boston morning. Hoping to clear my head, I decided to take Roxy for a walk along the Charles River. The city was just beginning to wake up, joggers weaving through the pathways, coffee shops opening their doors, and the first rays of sunlight glinting off the water. As I strolled, I let the calmness of the morning wrap around me like a soft blanket. That's when I saw him. Liam was sitting on a bench near the water's edge, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup and his eyes fixed on the horizon. He looked relaxed but lost in thought, the same way he always did when something weighed on his mind. Roxy spotted him first, her tail wagging furiously as she bounded ahead to greet him. "Good morning," he said, standing as I approached. His smile was soft, tentative, but genuine, like he wasn't sure if I'd be happy to see him. "You're up early," I replied, trying to sound casual even as my heart did a little flip. "I thought you might be here," he admitted, gesturing to the empty spot on the bench. "Mind if I join you?" I sat down, and for a while, we didn't say much. Roxy lay at our feet, her head resting on her paws, content as always to just be near us. Liam handed me a second coffee he'd clearly brought just for me. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but quiet, "about last night, about us." I glanced at him, my fingers tightening slightly around the warm cup in my hands. "So have I." He turned to face me, his expression both nervous and resolute. "Rachel, I don't want to rush you, but I also don't want to pretend anymore. I know how I feel about you, and I've known it for a long time. I need you to know that." The vulnerability in his voice tugged at something deep inside me. I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers with his as I finally let myself say the words that had been building inside me for days. "I feel the same, Liam. I always have." I was just too afraid to admit it. The relief on his face was immediate, his smile breaking through like the first rays of sunlight after a storm. He squeezed my hand, and in that small, simple gesture, I felt the weight of all our unspoken fears and hopes finally lifting. The morning grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, bathing us in golden light. Roxy stirred, her tail thumping lazily against the bench, as if to remind us she was still there, keeping watch over this new chapter in our lives. We didn't talk much after that, but we didn't need to. Sitting together by the river, with Roxy at our feet and the promise of something beautiful unfolding between us, I realized that the future didn't feel so uncertain anymore. It felt full of possibility, of us, and whatever came next.